So we're up to Achilas Kodshim Kalim, and we're on the top of the left column on Yudalid. I think there was one last thing that we had to fill in, perhaps, on what we did yesterday, and that is we have a concept called Lemoshcha, Ligdula, which generates a regulation, a requirement in the context of the mitzvah of the Kohanim to eat Kodshim. And they have to eat it sluyim, shlukim, vusholim, in a way that they will enjoy the eating. They can even put tavlinim on. A Kohen who's B'tzar Gadol, which I don't know if we finished yesterday, is Eino Ochel Kodshim, because that's not Derek Kedula. Which, if I understand correctly, would mean that a Kohen who had a very bad headache, a migraine, that he would not be eating Kodshim. But I don't know if I mentioned this to you yesterday. I think I did. And Tziv says that they had special begadim, that they designated very fancy white begadim to wear when they ate Kodshim. Did I mention that? If it rings a bell. He says also they should be eating in a sitting position, not in a standing position. It's not derech gedula. He quotes here a Tosfos in Reish Samach Vav on the bottom right, that if it makes no difference to him, he enjoys roasted meat, cooked meat, boiled meat, it's all the same to him, then nevertheless, Tosfos insists he should be roasting the meat because that's more of derech gedula. That's why the Gemara says, Mecheles sli bechardal. That's the epitome of the way you would serve meat in the kingly way. Okay. Now, Nechleku Rishonim, Im Achilas Kodshim Kam L'Bailim, V'Amura Mehem L'Kohanim, Mitzvos Aseihi. What's the status of the Bailim who are eating Kodshim Kalim? Or that section that is dedicated for the Kohen, is that a mitzvah saseh of achila? Some Rishonim want to say, he quotes here a Rashi in Masechet Pesachim, that nigreres achar mitzvah, that even though I guess the primary obligation is incumbent upon the Kohanim, but nevertheless, even the Bailim, and even if the primary mitzvah is on the basar, not the chaz v'shot, but nevertheless, it's nigra. It's an extension of the mitzvah. And therefore, when the Bailim eat Kodshim Kalim, they too should be subject or subcategorized, if you will, under the general halacha of Lemoshcha L'Gdula, because Nigreres Achar Mitzvah. Another dimension of Lemoshcha, I think we mentioned it yesterday, is Nechal Al Asova. He shouldn't be eating the meat when he's ravishly hungry. He He should eat it when it's enjoyable. He's already satiated himself. He's not achila gasa at that point, but it'll bring him to severe. That's called achila asov. And if that's a requirement in Kodshim, or in that part of the Kodshim column that are given to the Kohanim, what about the Bailim? Would they also, under this category of Ligreres Achar Mitzvah, be required to eat Lemoshcha with an Achila Lasova? And we'll take a look for a moment in note number Reish Samach Tes, quoting the Mishnah Lamelech in the 10th chapter, Maisa Korbanos, in the name of Tosfos, that Dover She'eno Matnas Kahuna Lo Nemar Bo Lemoshcha. The halach, the requirement of Lemoshcha L'Gdula, only applies to Matnas Kahuna, and therefore would not apply to the Achilas HaBailim in Kodshim Kalim. However, the Rishonim do apply Lemoshcha to Korban Pesach, and that's not Achilas Kohen. So it seems like it's a general halach in Kodshim that whenever there's a mitzvah in Kodshim, whether it's the Kohanim or the Bailim, that generates a chiyuv of Lemoshcha. It should be eaten L'Gdula. That's against Tosfos. Tosfos says that Lemoshcha is limited and applies only to Matnos Kahuna. Now the Mishnah says, with regard to Achilas HaPesach in Masechta Psochim, that im hoya achilas mu'etes mevi ima chagigas habasar kedei she'pesach nechal al asova. So we see clearly that with regard to Korban Pesach, we definitely have a requirement of nechal al asova. And the Rashbam in Psochim explains that that is a reflection and an application of the din of Lemoshcha. So if Lemoshcha applies to Korban Pesach, hence the Pesach has to be eaten al asova, then clearly it's not restricted to Matnas Kahuna, because Pesach is not Matnas Kahuna. Now, I would suggest, I didn't see the balance of this footnote, but I would suggest that perhaps al asova is a different requirement. It doesn't come under, and it's not generated by Lemoshcha. There's an independent requirement of al asova, which enhances the achila itself. Eino doma achila kisha'adam roev la'achila kisha'adam sober. And to embellish that achila, upgrade it to a zeh kelim aveyu, if we assume that even when the Bailim, and certainly in Korban Pesach, there's a mitzvah of achila, v'yochlos haposim b'layla zeh, we embellish that with an achila al hasova. But that doesn't necessarily take us as far as Lemoshcha. For that we need matnas kahuna. Imkeni says, Hadavar toli b'shitas hashonos im bekodshim kodshim. I'm sorry, bekodshim kalim nemar lemoshcha. Remember, we started on the top of this column, this left column on top of the page, with the machlokas rishonim whether kodshim kalim come under lemoshcha. And if the Rishonim attribute the requirement of al asova and Pesach to Lemoshcha, means that we're going to apply Lemoshcha even to Kodshim Kalim, because Korban Pesach clearly is Kodshim Kalim. Now he quotes from Chaim, Korban Pesach chaluk mi shar Kodshim Kalim. He quotes the Brisker Rav, sheyesh lo chiach mikach she'esach hagiga ochlu odem ha-pesach v'lo nechla al asova harei she'ein b'kodshim kalim din zeh. We see clearly that according to this explanation, there is no requirement of alasova in chagiga because it's kodshim kalim. Umishum she'ena mitzvah sasei gemura el nigreres achar mitzvah. Kodshim kalim is only a secondary obligation or kiyum of achil. It's nigreres achar mitzvah. Ikar mitzvah is the kohanim of. And that's a mitzvah saying incumbent upon every single Jew. There we require alasova, so you have to eat the korban pesach at the end of your meal when you're pretty much satiated. And even though it's kodshim kalim, and according to many Rishonim, kodshim kalim is only nigreres achar mitzvah. It's not the ikar mitzvah itself, and therefore, with regard to the achil of kodshim kalim, we do not have the requirement of nechal asoba, of lemoshcha. It's only a nigreres, and therefore it doesn't get that special status and requirement of lemoshcha. But nevertheless, korban pesach really is a mitzvah achila, not midin nigreres, not because since the Kohanim have a mitzvah to eat it, will extend that mitzvah to the secondary category of Yisraelim. No. Everyone, Kohen, Levi, Yisrael alike, are obligated in the mitzvah of Achilas Korban Pesach. Whenever we upgrade the status of Achila to an independent mitzvah, it's not a nigrar, it's not an extension of a mitzvah of Achila, but it's in and of itself a mitzvah Achila. Then we apply l'moshcha, and we require nechal alasov. That's the upshot of the brisket Torah. So we always have to declare and decide whether this achila is a nigrar, it's a secondary extension of the main achila, which means the main achila is the kohanim, or is it an ikar mitzvah unto itself? And then afkamina is whether you require l'mashcha and whether you require nechal al hasol. And this really leads up to the next line here, that korban pesach einu nechal el tzli. And tzli is a reflection of l'mashcha l'gdula, which applies to korban pesach because that is the ikar mitzvah. It's the achila. Now, in Chagiga of Yudalid, we don't have to impose the obligation of tzli because Chagiga is not korban pesach. Korban pesach requires tzli. Chagiga doesn't require tzli. One Tana says that the requirement of tzli applies even to Chagiga. And that could be understood under the category of nigreres, that in Kodshim Kalim, like Chagiga, we have a din of nigreres, that the Achilas Habaylim is schlepped along by the Achilas Kohanim, and just like the Achilas Kohanim requires l'machcha, we will impose that obligation of l'machcha on the Bailim as well. Hence, we require tzli. To stand up, sorry. Now we start a section which is called Basar Chatos HaPnimis. So we have Chatos Pnimios, like for example on Yom Kippur, and After Haktoras Haimurim, the Kohen now takes the animal when it's whole and leaving out the Emurim, which are burnt on the Mizbeach. The balance of the Behema is to be brought out Shlema. Yesh Omrim, there's another opinion, and this is apparently the Rambam's opinion, Shemachatcha Kodem Hotza Lechatichos Gdolos, that he should be cutting it up into very large sections. Achadayin Meuros Achatichos Zu Bazukim Kliya. So he's got all the different limbs or sections of the animal that are sort of braided together, and he takes it out to the Beis Hadeshen. Shehimi Chutz La'ir. I mean, there was a deshen on the Mizbeach itself, but I'm talking about the Beis Hadeshen, which was outside of the city of Yerushalayim. Shehumi Chutz L'Sholosh Machnos. Right, Machna Shechina is the Azara, Machna Levi is the Har Habayis, Machna Yisrael is Yerushalayim. So once he leaves Yerushalayim, he's Chutz L'Gimel Machnos, and there, outside of Yerushalayim, there was a Beis Hadeshen. Menateach HaSeivarim Kimo Nituach HaOlah V'sarfen osam im haperesh b'kirba. We're taking it out whole, or according to the Rambam, sections, but we bring the sections together. We do not remove the perish, all that intestinal repulsive refuse. We don't have to, because the animal is whole. V'sarfen osam Al Gabi Eitzim, we're no longer in the Mikdash. We don't need Eitzim that was sanctified as Hegdesh, but Bechol Sukshu, any type of Eitzim will be fine. Afilu Kach Begova, you could use straw. Seifosam Kshera Bizar. So all of the requirements of avoda are suspended with regard to the burning of the chatos pnimis in the Beis Hadeshen outside the city. We don't have any requirements of kahuna. It could be a zar. We don't have a requirement of yom as we do in avoda, not laila. It can be done by anyone, and day or night. Okay, now we get to a concept called tnufa. The carbon shlomim. So if we were in Chatas Pnimius, that's the moment after Haktoras Haimurim that we bring the entire animal out of the city of Yerushalayim and burn it there in the Beis Hadeshen. What do we do after Haktoras Haimurim in the case of Shlomim? Obviously, what we're anticipating is that the Bailam will eat the bosom. You've already given the Mizbeach its share of Achilus Mizbeach through the Haktoras Haimurim. Now we're ready for the Bailam to eat. He says, number one, you have to give the Chazav V'Shok to the Kohen. Matnas Kuhun. Meinicham al Yidei HaBailim. And he doesn't clarify this, but the impression I get is that the actual delivery of the chaz of the shok, transferring it from the bailim. It should be transferred from the bailim to the kohen. And now he says, "Alovim lemata chazav shok aleha." So I must have missed something here. 1 second. The achash kohen it's emurim lehaktara. The esachazav ashok lekohen. The nicham al yidei. What does that mean? Nicham al yidei pilot. He's referring to the emurim. A little confused. So the emurim have to be burnt on the mizbeach, correct? What does he mean? Nicham al yidei pilot. Oh, now I understand. See, I missed the punchline here. We're talking about tnufa. And tnufa applies to the emurim before they're actually burnt on the mizbeach. So when he says li'achar shahotzi hakohenes ha'emurim, what he means is that the kohen has prepared the emurim for haktara, but it hasn't yet been burnt on the mizbeach. And why? Because we're waiting for tnufa. Now, how do we set up the basar kodesh for tnufa? It's got to be in the following order. Meinicham al yidei bailim in the following tiers, T-I-E-R-S, right? Alovim lemata chaz v'shok aleim v'al kulam shtei hakloyos v'yoseres hakohen. Now, we're up to tnufa. Hakohen meniches yodo mitachas yidei bailim umenifem osam li'arba ruchos safon dorom mizrach ma'arav u'malim osam lemala umoridim lemat. And he compares it to nanuim in a lulav. So he's got 4 directions plus lamala and lamat. So I'm going to go back to the beginning of this paragraph and reinterpret it. You see those words, Meinicham al yidei bailim. What that means is that the Kohen, I think, is placing the emurim on the hands of the bailim. Does that make sense? In other words, hakohanim meinicham al yidei habaylim, on the hands of the baylim. I'm not sure. I don't want to say something that's totally stupid. Loving lemata, the shok aliyah, el kulam shtei akloyos v'yisur. What is this? I had a theory, but I don't know. It doesn't work out. What I thought was that there's halacha of eina ovrim ala mitzvahs. That might explain why the kloyos and the oseres hakovin are on top. Because right after the tnufa, the first thing he wants to do is take the kloyos, the oseres hakovin, and put it on the eish of the mizbech. But then I don't understand, then why are the chalavim placed on the bottom? In the chaz v'shok aliyah. So if I understand correctly, he's got shtei akloyos, etc. on the top. But below that, he's got the chaz v'shok. And on the bottom, he's got chalav. So why the split between shtei kloyos and chalav? If you want to look in the footnotes, because I don't think I saw anything in the footnotes that would help us. But for some reason, unbeknown to me at least, the chaz v'shok is wedged in the middle of the emurim. The chaz v'shok will be eaten by the kohen. And in order for the kohen to eat the chaz v'shok, they have to first bring the emurim and be makter them on the mizbeach. So why then are we placing the chaz v'shok above the chalav? I mean, the first thing he has to do before he gets to eating the chaz v'shok is he's got to fulfill the obligation of haktoras haimurim, which includes the chelev. So why is the chelev on the bottom? I don't know. I was hoping it would work out with the principle of ein over and al mitzvahs, but I don't see how to work that out. Now it's interesting that he says that the snufa follows the pattern of nanuim and lulav. Now I would have thought it goes the other way around, that the nanuim and lulav should follow the pattern of tnufa and kodshim. Because nanuim and lulav is a secondary aspect of it. And it's, in a sense, it's a mirror image of Tnufa. Tnufa should be what we call the Avtipus, the archetype. And then Lulav should imitate Kodshim and Zvachim. I don't know. The footnotes don't help me.
You think just because we're familiar with Lulav.
Oh, so it could be that's what he means. He's just telling you, it's the way he's explaining to you how they did the Tnufa. But it wasn't that the Melamed was Lulav and the Nilmad was Kodshim. It was the other way around. But if you want to know how to transmit to your audience, how the Tnufa should be done, send them to the Lulav, because that's what they're familiar with. Kohen. This is a Chiddush he attributes to Minchas Chim. In other words, the requirement of a Kohen placing his hands underneath the hands of the Bailim of Israel is part of the avoda. But if the Kohen himself is bringing his own carbon, he's the Bailim, he doesn't need another Kohen in order to implement Tnufa. He can just do Tnufa on his own. The only reason we required a Kohen, we brought in a Kohen from the bench in order to do Tnufa, was because we have the Yisrael Bailim. And Yisrael Bailim can't do Tnufa on his own, because Tnufa has to be accompanied by a Kohen. That upgrades it to the status of an avoda. But if you already have the Kohen and he's bringing his own carbon, so he can do his Tnufa as a lone ranger, he doesn't need the help of another Kohen. So it's not a separate chiyuv of bringing a Kohen for the Tnufa as a chovas gavra, so to speak, a separate independent obligation. But rather, we don't have a Kohen to do the Tnufa, we need to bring in a Kohen to do the Tnufa. It doesn't mean that the Bailim are excluded or exempt, but in a case where the Bailim is the Kohen and the Kohen is the Bailim, there's no need to separate them into two and bring in a Kohen off the bench. Because then the Kohen is doing the Tnufa, that's all we need, is for the Kohen to do the Tnufa. I'm tempted to think that Tnufa is halacha in the chefts of the korban. It's not a din in the gav. It's not the chovas Kohen as an independent chovas gav. No, this is just the way the Kodshim have to be brought. They have to be brought with Tnufa. The Aktoras Haiburim is after Tnufa. Or alternatively, maybe you don't have to go that direction. Just say that Tnufa is a chovas gavra, but it's primarily a chovas bailim. It's not a chovas Kohen. The only reason I need a Kohen is because if the bailim is not a Kohen, he can't implement. It's a din in the Isa Tnufa of the Kiyum Tnufa before that I need a Kohen. Once I have a Kohen, I don't need to bring in another Kohen. But it could be that Tnufa is a chovas bailim, as a chovas gavra. It's not just the Kiyum and the carbon itself. Okay, then, so let's see where we got up to. Nufa the carbon total, correct? Well, if we get a toner, if not, I'll borrow yours, or maybe I'll borrow yours for the night and or something, and hopefully give it back to you tomorrow.